being able to say, okay, if we were actually going to prioritize culture and people, how would a company do it?
Welcome to episode 91 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. I'm your host, Rohit Bhargava. My guest for this episode is Jenn Lim. Jenn is the CEO and CHO, the Chief Happiness Officer, of Delivering Happines, a company that she and Tony Hsieh, CEO of Zappos.com, co-founded to inspire science-based happiness, passion, and purpose at work, home, and in everyday life. Jenn has been a consultant with Zappos from its startup days in 2003 to the several billion-dollar business it is today. In 2010, Jenn led the launch and management of Tony's first book, Delivering Happines, which sold over 800,000 copies internationally and hit number one on numerous bestseller lists, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. It was voted one of the best business books by NPR, Inc. magazine, and the Wall Street Journal, remained on the New York Times list for 27 weeks, and has been published in 20 languages around the world. The success of the book led to Jenn and Tony starting Delivering Happines, the company, a coaching and consulting business that helps create a happier culture resulting in more profitable businesses. In this interview, we dive deep into company culture, discussing topics such as how to identify and define company values, how to hire based on your team culture, and how to continue to develop and evolve the culture as the company scales over time. Without further ado, here is my interview with Jenn Lim. Hi, Jenn. Welcome to the Startup Playbook Podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Well, thanks for having me, Rohit.
For those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
So I guess if I rewind to the days of when the first .com was, alive in Silicon Valley in the late 90s, I went through that and then became an independent consultant at Zappos.com when it was a tiny little startup, and then kind of as it grew, I grew with it and eventually started working on its culture back in the day when culture wasn't really too much of a buzzword yet. And then fast forward probably 8 years into that, that's when Delivering Happines, the book deal came about. And Tony, the CEO of Zappos, asked if I wanted to be a part of that project. So I said, sure, why not? And really thought we were just going to check it off of the things to do. But lo and behold, there turned out to be demand for happiness in the world. So decided to evolve into a company. And that's what I'm currently running today, Delivering Happines, the company.
Fantastic. And so I think most people would be familiar with Zappos, but if they aren't, can you give a little bit of a spiel of the company?
Yeah, of course. So basically, here's one of those many startups that tried to do its thing back in the first .com, and it just kind of weathered a lot of highs and lows and wasn't able to manage to be one of the survivors. And it's basically a shoe store online at a time when no one thought anyone would buy shoes online. You can't try them, etc. So what they did was try to flip the coin of what expectation means to shop online. So they did things, I guess they're the pioneers of doing things like free return shipping and 365-day guarantee return policy. So things that you just would not expect at that time. And now, of course, it's par for the course. So because of that, I think that's kind of how they innovated what customer service meant online at the time. And then evolved into a more mature place of actually also focusing on its people. And so culture became its number one priority, which is kind of, I think, they became a poster child for. And then eventually got acquired by Amazon for about $1.2 billion at the time of closing, which was about 6 years ago now, I think.
I guess a lot of people would be familiar with the customer service aspect of Zappos, which is, there are so many incredible stories of how Zappos went above and beyond from a customer service perspective. Probably something that might not be as well known, as you mentioned, is the focus on internal culture within Zappos as well. And probably at that time, again, as you said, it wasn't really a buzzword or not really something that people focused on. So what was it like at that stage to define or understand and implement culture within a company when perhaps wasn't as well understood on a wider scale?
Yeah, I'm trying to reflect because it feels so long ago in terms of those early days. I think it was, I guess the best way I can describe it, it was just a petri dish of things one can focus on to focus on essentially employee happiness and people and therefore company culture. So I think it was just testing ideas that have come up along the way. And so the whole thought of core values was a very corporate term at that time. And so we were thinking of like, hey, well, how do you make a corporate concept into something that still feels true to the culture? And so as opposed to what other companies were doing, which was, having a senior offsite off in the woods and then coming up with core values and then coming back on Monday saying, these are our core values, live them. So an example of what Zappos did differently was actually asked every single employee, what are your own personal core values? And then through a whole process, which actually took quite a long time, about a year, I feel. Yeah, it was about a year's time to get it and boil it down to the 10 core values that they incidentally still have today. But what's different about that is that you had everyone's contribution, but at the same time, you had ownership. So that people at the end of it, they said, these are our core values. This isn't the company I want to work for, I'm going to leave. Or this is the company I want to work for because these are my values as well, so I'm going to stay. So it's an interesting kind of self-selection process of these little tests that we did in this petri dish. Things like the culture book was another test. Publishing everything word for word of what employees thought of their culture was kind of an unknown concept at that time. And so, yeah, it was just being able to say, okay, if we were actually going to prioritize culture and people, how would a company do it? So I think that's kind of how it evolved.
As you mentioned, it's a lot of testing to try and develop what that playbook really looks like. What are some of the key components of trying to identify what those 10 core values are?
Different companies do it different ways. The way Zappos did it, the way Delivering Happiness did it, was to get everyone's input. Other companies don't feel that they want to do that, but I guess I would strongly advise to do it in the former way because, again, it really comes back to what kind of culture do you want to build. If it's going to be a top-down kind of culture, then, yeah, naturally it's okay to say, these are our values, now live them. But if, like, as most companies are today, especially startups, really needing the buy-in of everyone in the company because there's 10 million hats to wear. And if you want everyone to actually fully be maximized in their job and productivity and passion for it, then it's really about ownership, co-ownership and co-creation. That's what I think we learned.
One of the things I've been really fortunate to see over the podcast for the last close to 2 years now has been just a wide variety of different people and companies and their approach to just culture and business in general. I imagine, there's no real right or wrong way to do this or to develop a culture, but how does a company find the right approach for themselves? How
I would think about it is that, as an example, a lot of companies, when they read Delivering Happiness or when they saw their success, Zappos' success, they said, okay, we're going to be Zappos and we're going to borrow your 10 core values and put it on our wall. And that kind of struck me as like, that's, quite an honor for other people to do that. But in the end, that's kind of actually the last thing I would recommend for any company is to copy exactly what Zappos did because that's not their DNA. So I feel like the approach needs to be unique to every single company's DNA. And of course, it depends on the leader or leaders of that company to be able to, provide that intention. Is it going to be top down or is it going to be truly co-created? And so by making those decisions, that kind of guides the direction and approach a company goes through. And that's why we're really big on higher purpose and core values as the foundational elements of a culture, because unless you have that, knowing all the changes that your company will go through and knowing all the ways that you need to adapt, without that foundational pieces of culture, purpose, and values, there's going to be no base. So I think approaches actually will be derived from those things.
Is there a particular stage or time that startups should seriously start thinking about their culture and setting those values? And if it is relevant for startups at that very early stage, how should they approach that for a company of that size?
All I have to say is that that was one of the biggest lessons learned / regret was that we didn't start and focus on culture from day one. Because once you start the company, it'll get that much harder as things evolve in the company, people will get added into the team. So that was our biggest lesson. Because if you don't set, again, those foundational elements, there's so much change that will basically kind of rock you off your boat that you're trying to steer in the right direction. So if it's just like let's say two co-founders, what we say is basically, all right, two people get together, share your own senses of what is our purpose, why are we doing this? Because even with two people in the room, let alone like we help leadership teams of 10, 20 people, even if you have a purpose statement on the wall in black and white, you get those people around the table and you ask them what it means, everyone will have their own definition. So that's why it's so important to be super concrete from the very beginning, from the get-go, to define exactly what that purpose is, why are we here, why are we doing this thing, and then what those values are. So two co-founders, I think, is an ideal time for saying, okay, let me identify my own personal core values. Let's put it together, see what those values could mean for this company, and test them. Because you can't expect that they're going to be tried and true from day one. It really needs to be tested alongside with the business objectives to see if they're going to stay on the wall, stick to it. If not, then how they're going to adapt. So for DH and Zappos, it took a year to refine, to say, okay, these are our values and this is what we're going to stick to.
Sure. And obviously, culture has been it's a topic that's come up across so many different interviews on this podcast. It's been really interesting, again, to kind of see the balance of how people kind of approach culture and how that changes and evolves over time. So as a company grows, are you looking for people that fit the particular culture that you have and stay, for lack of a better term, rigid to it? And this is kind of the core definition of what we believe in all the time? Or does that culture evolve over time, and the people that you bring in are adding and evolving and changing that culture over time?
I mean, it's interesting what you're saying, that culture keeps on popping up in your podcast. I think it was maybe 2 years ago, Merriam-Webster, the dictionary, claimed that culture was actually the most used word in the world. And that was striking to us because, when we started talking about culture like 15 years ago, we're like, whatever. But to answer your question, it's inevitably going to evolve. That's why those foundation elements are so important, because there's so many companies that 1, 2, 5, 10 years down the road, they keep on adding people that seem to fit, because those skills are needed or because that experience is needed, which is great. But unless there's this commonality, this thread that pulls it back to, wait, this is why this company exists in the first place. And unless those kind of like threads are built into onboarding and like recruiting and all that, so that's understood, then all of the foundational stuff is going to be lost. But I think it will evolve, even with those foundation elements, because the business needs to evolve. Because elements around any company are going to change. And so how are you going to adapt with that, knowing you want that core foundation in place of culture?
Obviously, that kind of naturally feeds into the hiring discussion that kind of takes place around culture as well. I've spoken to a lot of founders, and something that seems to just be a constant issue, regardless of scale and stage of a company. Mm-hmm. Is there a particular approach that you recommend in terms of going through the hiring process and finding whether someone does have that sort of cultural fit with the business, skills and everything aside? Mm-hmm. And also, when you are bringing someone new into the business, how do you then translate and get them to buy into the culture of the business as well?
One thing we learned back in the day that's still eerily relevant, that we still say, because it still pertains, is to hire and fire based on values, and to hire slow and fire quick. So hiring and firing based on values is like, yes, of course, make sure there's a fit of these values and make sure that this person is actually invested in them and actually are aligned with them. And sometimes it's a science, sometimes it's an art of being able to see this person outside of the typical work day. Some people are A+ interviewers or interviewees, and they'll always get the job, but get them out of that traditional interview situation in real life in situations and see how they normally react is more important. So we believe in the dating game. It's more of like, hey, it's not like here's your job, or here you're hired, let's start. It's like, let's date for like 3 months. And let's set these goals. And let's see if we, it's a two-way game. It's not just like us judging them. It's both being able to say, yes, we want to do this together. Let's go on to the next date. So that's hiring and firing based on values, and hiring slow, firing quick is super important. It sounds really harsh, but we know it only takes that one person in the whole company, startup, department, whatever it is, that changes the whole dynamic for everyone else. And we have to ask ourselves as founders or co-founders of, is it really worth, even if it's a rock star, performer, killing in the sales or whatever it is it really worth the expense of everyone else's productivity, engagement, therefore happiness, because of this one person? And so even though it seems like a hard decision, if you actually put it on paper, black and white, it makes it an easy one because it's kind of financial and it's like for the betterment of long-term culture. So definitely spend more time in hiring slow. Find the right people, date as long as you want to make sure that it's the right fit.
Once you do find the right people, how do you, especially a company that's hiring constantly and is going through a fast growth phase, how do you effectively ensure the onboarding process or the culture that's been developed from the team up until now is then communicated to people when you're going from 10 to 20 to 50 to 100 people?
So there's the onboarding process, which is essentially, we kind of like bring them through the whole journey of the why, the history, to get everyone as much as you can up to speed and synced up as to what the culture foundation is. Again, higher purpose, values, behaviors out of those values. And so once there's that synchronization of foundational pieces, then the key is scaling. And I know this is the most overabused word in every startup, but it really is, how do you scale that culture from there? And so we believe it's not just top down, not just HR, it's actually the whole company. So to be able to do that, you would find in any company there, there's natural people that kind of rise up to wanting to be that culture champ, wanting to be that culture ambassador outside of the CEO, outside of HR. And so that's what we encourage companies to form, are those culture champs, culture masters, whatever you want to call them, because they're actually the biggest cheerleaders of making the culture live. And just to dovetail on that aspect of living culture, I think the biggest key in that is being able to embed all this culture stuff I talk about in every organizational system. Recruiting, onboarding, offboarding, rewards and recognition, even how you run your meetings. So you think about every single process you have as an organization, make sure those foundational elements of culture are there, and you kind of feed it through that, then you're living it more organically rather than forcing it down people's throats.
Just briefly, you touched on firing as well, and I feel like there's often perhaps a misconception of companies with fantastic cultures that they never hire the wrong people and everyone always wants to say, and no one ever gets fired. Again, I've spoken to a lot of founders and for a lot of founders, myself included, sometimes it's very difficult making that decision as well. Yeah. Do you have any advice in terms of how do you identify whether someone, I guess taking my personal example, I guess something that I often struggle with is, have I just not created the right environment for a particular person to succeed, or for them to have the right sort of fit? Or is it just that they're not the right person? And how do you kind of draw the line between those two? Do you have any advice for me in terms of how to deal with that?
Stop being such a nice guy. I'm just kidding. No, our belief system is that for every person, it's 50% skills fit and 50% culture fit. And if any of those elements is going awry, the general rule we have is like kind of 3 strikes you're out. It's not that like once you underperform or once you break this culture, this value, it's not like, okay, see you later. But it is going back to hiring and firing based on values, hiring and firing based on skills. So what we encourage, and it becomes a more of a dialogue, so that's like, okay, hey, I noticed that you haven't been living up to this core value, and these are the ways that we've seen that happen, and these are the ways that we'd like you to improve on that. And so it's kind of like, warning. And then if you see it happen again, it's like another, like, hey, sorry, this is happening again. So what can we do as an organization, even though we're a startup, 10 million things are going on at one time, how can I support you achieve this? And so it becomes like this 2-way exchange of information. So by the 3rd time, if it happens again, whether it's the culture side or the skill side. It's not this slap in the face or just like this pink check. I don't know if you do pink checks here in Australia, but saying sorry, you're not a fit anymore. It becomes a known entity, and sometimes it's self-selective too, in the sense like, okay, I'm the employee that just can't do that from a culture side, so I'm actually going to leave. So it just becomes more of a human way to do it. It's not personal. It's just you're not a good fit for this company.
Hearing your talk at launch yesterday, one of the things that you mentioned was that you wanted to study Asian American studies,
Right.
and it wasn't something that your parents necessarily approved. But just kind of your general talk was about happiness in general and kind of people finding that. But again, do you want to kind of share a little bit of that story and your kind of background about how you got into this space?
Yeah. So, the whole immigrant story of just, I'm sure you can empathize as well. We talked about that. Just like we know that our parents, our ancestors, every generation has gone through so much to get us to where we are today, to be even having this conversation. It's so crazy, incredibly cool and lucky. And so being able to say, I got into UC Berkeley at the time, and as I was following those footsteps I was supposed to lead, I was going to be a doctor, at a good school. I knew how to play piano, stuff like that. That doesn't really matter in the bigger scheme of things, but made me feel successful, quote unquote. But once I started studying, it totally felt wrong. Like it didn't feel like me. And so I started wandering, and I stumbled upon Asian American studies. And I think you have that here, like Asian. Yeah, I've met some people. So similar sort of like this whole thing of like, whoa, we've actually done a lot to help this country. And it was the first time I felt passionate about something. And it was the first time I kind of stood up to my parents and said, you know what, I can't live like this anymore. Against this feeling of passion, and so decided to major in it and all that. And fast forward, graduated, realized what they were talking about. I couldn't find a job, and then it was my turn to freak out. So it really was luck and time and place of being in the Silicon Valley era of the first .com, where I cold called every company I knew until I finally found a job. But it just changed the trajectory of my life of saying, because I finally stood up. And it wasn't against my parents, per se. It was for myself. And it felt foreign, but it felt finally good that I can actually say, I'm going to do this and not fear what might come out of it. And that kind of changed the trajectory to get me into happiness. Because a big part of happiness and what we talk about is living true to your authentic, or we say weird, self. We just believe everyone's weird to a certain extent. So number one is being true to that. And then the other steps towards authentic happiness is living a sense of passion, flow, and ultimately a sense of purpose. So, what are you as an individual doing that's bigger than yourself? What is your company doing bigger than making more money in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, slightly different, but like very similar story for me, which was I studied engineering and economics. My parents had this grand ambition for me to get into engineering and all those things. I realized 6 weeks in that it wasn't what I wanted to do. They forced me to stick around for 2 years, and they said that they would. I came to an agreement with them that if I stick around for 2 years, I could do whatever I wanted. And so I stuck out 23 months before I jumped into my own startup to launch a fashion tech startup, which they still have no idea what I do in general. But I think just going back to that, I think there's just, we're even starting to see this in the startup space. So previously, or still to a degree, there's this expectation of what you should do in terms of career. In Australia, a lot of it is, you should go work at a big four or those sort of things. And so jumping out of that and jumping into a startup can be a difficult decision for people, even if that's what they really want to do or what they're really passionate about. But similarly, in the startup space, I feel like there's still, and you touched on this a little bit earlier as well, in terms of expectation of how you should run a company, or, Zappos does it this way. They're a huge success. I need to run my company exactly like Zappos as well. But I feel like, similar to you, true success really comes into how do you find the most authentic version of this for yourself. For anyone that's going through this, and again, this is going to be a really big question for you, how do people find what the authentic or kind of true version of that is for themselves?
Probably in the next fortune cookie you open. So I really believe it's about, we talked about testing earlier. So Zappos is a petri dish for culture. I think we're all petri dishes of ourselves. And Sometimes it's not knowing what you want or who you are. It's knowing what you don't want or knowing who you are not. And the more we put in ourselves in those situations, so it has to do with like being open-minded and feeling like being open to luck, and being open to failure. And I think it's this trial and error basis that's if it becomes like a natural cycle within self, then the more effective it will be to get us to that more focused, filtered place of true authentic self. And I would have to say, like, there are certain moments where like, oh yeah, figure it out, done. But the reality is it's never done. Because every phase of your company, every phase of self will keep on throwing things at all of us that we've never expected. So I would just see it, and this sounds very cliche and proverbial, but just like happiness, it's a journey. Just like our lives of authenticity, it's a journey. And it's really back to like being so lucky to be alive in this time and place in this world. We have no excuse not to explore that and embrace the good, bad, and ugly of that, and just be able to live up to the fact that, hey, we can make decisions like leaving a great job and doing a startup. I mean, I don't want to sound like one of those, just 10 years ago when we did that, it's so much easier now. It's like the generational envy complex. It's like, it is really so much easier now, because there's so many examples of what that could mean in a meaningful way, not just making money.
Absolutely. I'm such a big proponent of going out there and trying different things. Like the podcast for me was just something completely random that I wanted to do selfishly to get better at communicating and talking to people. And it's, opened up so many different opportunities and all of those things, which I never would have expected to come my way or even thought of as well. So I think it's, as you mentioned, just being open to trying different things and letting right place, right time, just lucky ingredients coming together.
So you're a good living example of that.
Exactly. Before we head off and wrap up the podcast, would love to talk a little bit more about your company and what you do and how people can find out more information.
So our focus now is being able to take all these lessons learned from not just Zappos, but all these other companies that we work with around the world. We're actually, half of our clients are international. And through these years of experience, been able to take the concepts of positive psychology, scientific happiness, mix it up in a bowl with corporate culture, and now we get to help organizations, hospitals, governments. It's pretty crazy. Help them understand and figure out, what does it mean to scale and sustain a true, authentic, happy culture. So yeah, that's kind of our focus in our business. And if anyone listening wants to learn more, just come and check us out, deliveringhapiness.com. Or you can always shoot me an email. I'm old school that way. It's just Jenn, that's Jenn, at deliveringhapiness.com if you have any questions about anything.
Jenn, thanks so much for coming on and sharing all of your expertise and insight. Is email the best way to get in touch with you, or can people follow you on social?
Oh, yeah, we've got social stuff going. I'm at DH Movement CEO, and our company is at DH Movement, and we're on Facebook and Instagram as well, and LinkedIn.
I'll make sure all of those links are in the show notes. Jenn, once again, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to episode 91 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. Full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.